doctors, Richard Carrier, Dennis R. MacDonald, thank you both for joining me. Question from my good friend Stephen Nelson, who helps support MythVision in other ways, not just financial. He has a question. It's mainly directed at Carrier's position, but it'll be interesting with you and your Greek and your New Testament awareness to give your take even. Even if it disagrees, that's okay. I expect to see you guys use your minds on this. So he says, Dr. Carrier, my question is about Galatians 4:4, where Paul says Jesus was born of a woman, born under the law. Hans Betz, in his commentary of Galatians, argues that Paul's implication is that Jesus was put under the law, meaning he was circumcised as a Jew and observed Torah. In what sense do you think that Jesus was under the law while living in the lower heavens? Was he subject to the requirements of Mosaic law, like circumcision, the Sabbath, and dietary restrictions? In your book, On the Historicity of Jesus, you argue, quote, that Jesus was by being incarnated, placed under the sway of the Old Covenant so that he could die to it, and that the woman here is simply the Old Covenant, not an actual person. What do you mean exactly when you say, in the sway of the Old Covenant? Is this any different from how Paul describes himself and other Jews as being under the law prior to their conversion to Christianity? Thank you.
Yeah, so to really understand where I am on this, I'll refer people to an article on my blog the title is, Yes, Galatians 4 is Allegorical, where I explain that that you have to understand this in the context of the entire... Paul is presenting a classical Greek speech here, a rhetorical argument using the rhetorical structures of Greek speeches. And the speech actually starts in chapter 3. So if you really want to understand it, read my article and I walk you through the rhetorical structure of this and what's going on. So that's really important to understanding what the summary I'm just going to say is, so what he says, he says this, that born of a woman, born under, and now, by the way, it's made, it's actually genomenos, right? So it's made under a woman. It's not geneste, or the other one that he uses for the actual Galatians. He says he uses a different word for born. And this is a Pauline style issue, so that he chooses these words carefully. And I've talked about that. The genomenos is like when Adam's body is formed. It's not birth, it's manufacturing. And when our future bodies will be formed, it's genomenos, not the other form of to born. It's a different word. So you have to understand the context here. But anyway, so he says, Jesus, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those that are under the law. And then he goes through the whole doxology of how you get baptized, etc. And then, so you are no longer a slave, but God's child. And since you are his child, God has also made you an heir, right? So now you're the heir, because you are now the son of God, you are an heir to his kingdom. Formerly, when you did not know God, you were slaves to those who by nature are not gods. But now that you know God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you are turning back to those weak and miserable forces? Do you wish to be enslaved by them all over again? And so he goes on and on and on. Eventually, he has this big digression there, and then he gets back around where he's saying that, let me explain to you what I'm talking about. And he says, these things are to be taken figuratively. This is an allegory. And he talks about the two women that we're all born of. We're born of Hagar if we're subject to the law of God, or subject to the universe. And here he's talking about the gods, the other gods, right? Not necessarily the covenant, but he's including the covenant in this. But he's talking about slavery to the elemental forces of the universe, but also slavery to, for example, if you have been circumcised and you're subject to the covenant. And he talks about the two covenants, really. So there's the covenant of the flesh, but then there's the covenant of the spirit. So if you're born of Sarah, you are born of the spirit, and therefore you can be free and live in the celestial heaven and stuff like that. But if you're born of Hagar, if you remain born of Hagar, you're subject to mortality and death and all of the other problems of sin. But in this particular case, when he's talking about, if you talk about the metaphysics, so let's assume the Doherty thesis is correct, the Mythicist thesis is correct that I defend On the Historicity of Jesus, the metaphysics of this. Yes, there's no baby Jesus, right? So like Jesus is fully formed as a man out of literally probably Davidic seed. His flesh is formed by God the same way Adam's body is formed to perform this function. And so it would be a circumcised body, obviously. It would be a fully Jewish body. It would therefore be completely covenantally controlled. It would be subject to the law of God. Has to be. Like, that's the whole concept of the metaphysics of this, is how the sacrifice of Jesus is going to work physically, right? So that would be the the direct answer to what he's asking there. But I think Paul is here including both the literal and the allegorical sense of the covenant, right? He's both saying people who are actually under the covenant, but also people who are under the laws of the universe, the laws of death and decay and subject to demonic forces and things like that. There's the two worlds you can be a part of. You can be a part of the material world, which is doomed and is subject to demons, or you can be part of the celestial world where you get to live forever. And so he's talking about both things at the same time. And so when he's talking about born under the law, he does mean Jesus was a full Jew in every sense, is like in the ideal sense, so that he could represent all Jews, basically. And then, of course, Paul wants to universalize this, therefore everyone. And so Paul has to struggle to say, even though you aren't a part of the covenant, by being baptized and becoming a son of God through becoming a brother of Jesus and all this stuff, you can bypass that whole covenantal stuff, but you're also bypassing the material world, all the faults of the material world that drag you down. And so you can get the same salvation that you can get through the covenant, through the new covenant, the Sarah covenant, rather than the Hagar covenant. So he's kind of like arguing that this is a new way you can bypass that. But he's using the old, like the pre-Pauline concept of Jesus as having been formed as a man, as the Philippians hymn says, like he was, God made a body for him, or made him into a man, into the appearance of a man, right? That's in the Philippians hymn. So that's pre-Pauline. So that doctrine definitely meant like he was formed as a Jew under the covenant so that he could die and take the covenant away with him. He had to be a covenantal Jew. And that, I think they clearly thought that was scriptural, like it had to be the case, which is where they get the idea. But in Mythicist model, this is a body that God made for Jesus that would serve the purpose. It was a properly circumcised Jewish body in the full sense. And so that's the logic that's going on here. Paul, of course, is working in a different context. He wants to expand this to universalize it. So he's trying to justify how this can apply to both Gentiles and Jews. But that's what's going on in here.
Galatians 3, like, he's trying to tell them.
Well, that's why I say Galatians 3 is so important. This is the finishing of the art. This is like, it's 4:1, it's middle of the argument, right? He's starting in 3, and he's working his way through the rhetorical structure, and then lands on this whole Hagar and Sarah allegory thing. He says, I'm talking about an allegory. So he's not talking about literal women. And that's true, I think, even if there's a historical Jesus. When he says born of a woman, it's not the physical woman that he's talking about. It's a metaphorical woman that he's talking about, even if Jesus had an actual mother, because I don't think that's relevant to Paul, and it wouldn't have been at the time, because being born to a woman doesn't make you a Jew, right? A Jewish woman at this time, that's a modern Israel citizenship rule. But back then, being a Jew meant a lot more than that. You couldn't just being born of a woman wouldn't make you any more Jew. Or if it did, he would say born of a Jewish woman. He doesn't say that either. So born of a woman here is the allegorical reference. And just as he mentions Abraham allegorically, we are all the seed of Abraham, even those who aren't literally the seed of Abraham. That's in chapter 3. He gets here, and when he completes the chiasm, essentially, he gets all the way to, well, even the women are allegorical. So you can be born of Hagar, born of Sarah. It no longer has anything to do with literal biological inheritance from Hagar or Sarah. It's just symbolical. He's talking about the symbology of how he's trying to integrate his Gentile teaching with the original Christian Torah teaching. So
I definitely want to get, I know Dennis will have a different take on this. I already expect
probably,
to have
yeah,
a totally different position. But before we do, I do want to mention Galatians 3 in the vein of this argument. And what caught my attention before that I could maybe like toss up and both of you gentlemen can tackle at the same time, or once I'd like to have Dennis maybe respond, and maybe, or if you want to say something, then Dennis, make sure you remember where you're at. Galatians 3, he seems to be arguing with the opponents of the Galatian church by trying to inform the Galatians and saying something like, this is how I've read it and I understand it right now. The opponents of Paul that are trying to misinform, according to Paul, the Galatian church are trying to say you need to convert.
Yeah, you need to circumcise, you need to become Jews. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And he's saying in his argument, which really is interesting and tricky, I love it, it's very developed thinking, he's going before Moses. He's going to Abraham saying, look, before he did any of this stuff, he's justified, right? And the gospel is preached beforehand to him, that you will be a blessing to all the nations and whatnot, by pulling that context out. But then he says something interesting that really got my attention. It is not to the seeds, but to the seed, singular, like one seed, Christ. And that technically you are a seed of Abraham in Christ.
Yeah.
How now? This is so like non-literal. There's just no way to read.
Correct,
I'm literally a seed of Abraham by being literally.
I mean, I can come up with a metaphysics that would be literally true for Paul, but it's not biology that it would be.
And it makes me think if Hagar is a representative of the world, right? Biological or potentially
The
material.
world order that the covenant is supposed to save you from, right?
Okay.
Because if you don't have the covenant, you're damned,
Right.
basically. The world is going to crush you and you're going to be, the devil will have you, and that's it.
But Sarah seems to represent...
And normally, before Paul comes along, of course, the preaching would have been, had this been Peter writing this, like there would be none of this business about that. He'd say, yeah, you better get into the covenant, because that's only people in the covenant get saved. If you want to be a seed of Abraham, you've got to join the covenant and swear in, right? But Paul, of course, that's not Paul's doctrine. So he has to like twist and bend to get the original Christian message to actually apply to his circumstance. So he's struggling here. That's why there's a 2-chapter long rhetorical argument he has to make to get them to like not do this, right? He said, no, you don't have to convert. Here's why. And it's an extraordinarily elaborate, convoluted rhetorical argument. And that's what we're in here.
Okay.
So
what's your take on, obviously, what you heard?
Well, I'm grateful that you brought in the larger context of Judaizers and different early Christian contestation about the function of honomos. Now, diatheke appears in this context, but it's nomos that's the most important word. So it's faith versus law, if you in simple terms. And I very much appreciate the dialectic of the larger context, what Paul's trying to accomplish. And there are a number of really quite clever tour de forces that actually are more non sequiturs than tour de forces in this argument. But I think it was helpful for Richard to say, from my view, that Paul wants to say that Jesus is a game changer, not just for Jews, but also for Gentiles. And so he talks about the elements of the world in the verse just prior to the one that we've been focusing on, because all humans are enslaved to the stoicheia to cosmo, the elements of the world. And there's a big argument about what that means. But for Greeks, it might be the 4 elements of Greek cosmology. But really, he understands that to be more of almost a Platonic diminution of reality or something. The word ginomai in this context can mean to be made, but it also can actually, in many cases, mean to come into being, meaning be birthed. But it's not the most common one for being sired or being birthed. There's no doubt about that. But we also have other
correct,
examples.
yeah, it can be used in both senses.
It can be.
Is this where you guys differ, though, you think?
We're going to get there. That's one really subtle difference between us. We would agree that verb can be translated in different ways.
Right.
When I see mater, I don't think it's allegorical. I think it's biological, because this is how the heavenly pre-existent Jesus comes into the world biologically and under the law. That might imply circumcision, but it doesn't require it. And I would give as an analogy the Q saying that appears in its best form in Luke. The law and the prophets were until John. After that, the kingdom of God is in force. And so already in the gospel tradition, well, later in the gospel tradition, depending on your dating,
Right, yeah.
but simultaneous, but certainly independently, Jesus is himself Jewish, but the law has a different function. Now, for the Q document, Jesus is simply reinterpreting the law and making it more compassionate. For Paul, the cross represents the death of the law, and his followers have died to the law. So the law no longer has a function. Now, what that allows, and this term, huiothesia, that occurs, which is let me get the verse. So that we might receive adoption, the taking over of sonship, it implies the kleonomia. That is, that it implies that this person will now have an inheritance, and the inheritance is probably something like eternal life for him. So here's how I would paraphrase these verses, which gets right to the heart, in a way, of the difference between a mythicist and a historicist.
Oh, of course, yeah. I think historicists definitely would take this as biological. So.
Right. So when the fullness of time came, now this is a time when Jews are under the law, and the rest of the world, including Jews, are captive to the elements of the world, whatever that means. Mm-hmm. God sent his son, produced from a woman, Gunaikos, produced under law, so he has the same verb, but now makes it that under traditional law, so that he might buy back or purchase those who are under the law by doing something to the law. And it's not said here in this text. In order that we might receive the homothesian, the adoption that includes the kleonomia. So it's really quite crucial about what this gegemenon ek matras means. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so it gets pretty close there. Now, I guess what I would want to say, though, is that both in the Q document and in Josephus, in my view...
Bird just pooped in my head.
No.
Welcome to California outside, right?
I was produced. No, I'm just kidding.
But and also in Paul, in one of his earlier letters, the importance of Jesus is is not that he's dying for sins, but he's removing the oppression of what he perceived to be the law. But it's selective. He himself is under the law to some extent, but he wants to open things up to others who are enslaved by the elements of the universe.
I think contextually, what Nelson really wants for the I.O. context is to say this like under the law does not necessarily mean inherently that you have already entered the covenant. What it is when you're under the law, you're doomed unless you obey the law, which means joining the covenant, circumcising,
That's
etc.
right. That's a helpful comment.
So it's saying under the law does not mean they're automatically instantly in the covenant.
Right.
It just means that the law is your only salvation. You're doomed. You're under the law. Now there's a law. The law is the law. So you're going to die and stay dead unless you get on with the law. Right. This would be the original, the Torah observant explanation of this. Is you're everyone's subject. Even Gentiles are under the law, in the sense that because they're not following it, they're fucked, right? That's the basic principle of it.
That's why I wanted to get to verse 3, because it says, and so also we, when we were children, were enslaved ourselves under the stoicheia tu cosmo, under the elements of the world. And the law is another form of enslavement for Paul.
Yeah, he does. Yeah, he speaks of that elsewhere, and it's from frying pan into the fire for Paul, right? It's like jumping from the doom of the cosmos to the law. The law is just as enslaving as the sin that you're trying to run away from, and so he's coming up with this alternative solution, which is if you faith in Jesus, baptism, adoption by God. If you're a son of God, well, now you're immune to all of this. You're no longer under the law. You don't have to follow the law to get saved. The law doesn't apply to you anymore, right? That's the Pauline argument that's going on here.
Thank you, gentlemen.